My name is Bernard Cooperman. I am the Kaplan Professor of Jewish History here, and it is my pleasure to chair this afternoon's discussion. Since I and almost everybody else in the world is totally at a loss about the meaning of the Israeli elections, and since Haaretz reported just an hour or two ago that a week late, President Obama has at last congratulated the future Prime Minister Netanyahu. Apparently he's become convinced that Netanyahu won. I'm looking forward to hearing what people who really know can tell us about the elections. You're going first, right? Who's going first?
I thought that you said that we'll go.
Okay,
start with Sam.
okay.
I don't mind.
No problem. So it is my pleasure first to introduce, I'll make it brief, Professor Sam Lehman-Viltzig, who is a professor of political studies at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He is a former Schusterman visiting Israeli scholar and has held visiting professorships at Brown University and San Diego State. His areas of expertise include new media and its impact on politics and society, political communications in Israel, contradiction in terms, and the Jewish political tradition. He is a noted Israeli columnist who has appeared regularly on Israeli radio and TV, and currently he is a visiting professor at the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies here on our campus and is teaching courses on Israeli media and elections. Professor Lehman-Viltzig.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The Israeli election results of 2013, I believe, might well prove to be a watershed, but not in the way that anyone expected or most people hoped. The overall balance between Israel's right and left didn't change very much, although it's now clear that the center has to be added to the traditional mix. Yair Lapid's victory with the Yesh Atid party that he established will not automatically revive peace talks to the Palestinians for two reasons. First of all, because Lapid is not a leftist. He's what I would call a dork, a dovish hawk. Second, the peace process is quite far down on his list of national priorities, so don't expect any quick or significant movement on that front. Well, what then did change in this election? And to understand the answer to this question, I have to return for a moment to Israel's campaign history. From 1949, the country's first election campaign, and up to and including 1992, elections in Israel were marked by fierce ideological debates of substance. Socialism versus free market, peace with our neighbors versus greater Israel, Ashkenazi dominance or inclusion of second Israel, the degree to which religion and state should be combined, and other really important issues. And then in 1996, the young, brash, United States-educated Benjamin Netanyahu entered the fray, bringing sophisticated professional political marketing into Israel's heretofore traditional election campaigns, along with Arthur Finkelstein we brought over. However, this was no real whim of Netanyahu. It actually made eminent sense, given two new phenomena on the Israeli scene back in the mid-1990s. First, direct elections for the prime ministership, in addition to the usual party list ballot. Second, the introduction of commercial television after decades of public Channel 1 monopoly. And this led to a personalization of Israeli campaigning, with increasing and broadening every subsequent campaign. Ehud Barak, after that, became the decorated war hero, using the services of James Carville. Ariel Sharon, another charismatic army general, ran in the elections after that. So we have a situation now in about 15, 16 years, several election campaigns of, shall we say, de-ideologization and greater personalization of the campaign. What happened in 2013? Well, in the Likud Yisrael Beitenu campaign, only Netanyahu appears on television and outdoor election propaganda. In fact, Lieberman completely disappears from view after his indictment by the state attorney general, probably a very wise move. It was as if the electorate wasn't choosing a party anymore, but rather a chief with unknown soldiers behind him. Even more amazingly, the Likud Yisrael Beitenu party did not even publish a political platform. This would have been unthinkable in the days of Ben-Gurion and Begin. After all, Zionist political parties and their supporters cared deeply for something, even if they were deeply divided on what precisely that something was. Not even the 2 states for 2 peoples policy that Netanyahu announced in his famous 2009 Bar-Ilan speech was mentioned during this campaign. In fact, when the party spokesman was asked if the Likud still accepted and adhered to Netanyahu's proclamation, the response was, the Likud includes a diversity of opinions. As a result of this parva stance on the issue and over-reliance on the leader, the list crashed. From 42 seats in the outgoing Knesset, if you take both parties together, both parties separately and together, to a mere 31 seats in the Knesset in the 2013 election results. Another loser, and I put loser in quotation marks here because everything is relative, was Shelley Yachimovich's Labor Party. Now it's true that they started, or she started the campaign with only 9 seats in the previous Knesset, but early in the campaign, the polls predicted that Labor would garner anywhere from 20 to 22 seats, and in the end, as we know, they only received 15 seats. Why? Because here too, Shelley tried to have her ideological cake and eat it too. Suggesting at first that under some conditions, Labor might join a Likud-led government, and then backtracking, no, we're not going to join the Likud government. And moreover, although Labor has always been firmly in the peace process camp, Yachimovich tried to attract centrist voters by saying nice things about the settlers and even denying that her party was in anything called left. She claimed that it was always a center party. Baloney. Thus, although she was a relatively fresh face as a party leader and did not project herself as the only face of Labor, as Bibi did with the Likud campaign, Labor had clearly lost, or at least overly fudged, its identity in this campaign, and I believe therefore suffered as well as a result. And the clear winners? Well, the clear winners were Yesh Atid, which gained 19 seats out of nowhere, and Habayit HaYehudi, which gained 12 seats, basically resurrecting what used to be the National Religious Party, the Mafdal. Now, on the face of it, sorry for that pun, these might seem to be new versions of the hyper-personalization syndrome with both Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett, respectively, very attractive, even charismatic party leaders. But that isn't what did the trick for them. Rather, they had a laser-like focus on their core issues, and that's what they kept on talking about during the campaign. Lapid's party emphasized the need to draft the Haredim into the army, change the election system, and lower the economic burden on the middle class. Bennett's party also stressed the army draft issue, as well as no compromising on the settlements issue. Moreover, their election campaigns highlighted the great heterogeneity of their party list candidates. They have both religious and secular. In the past, one never found secular candidates on a religious party list, as now is the case with Bayit Yehudi. And on the other hand, a rabbi was number 2. He was number 2 on Lapid's secular party list. A good number of women, by the way, number 17 who got into the Knesset is a Haredi on Lapid's party list, which is totally incredible. A good number of women are to be found in both parties, and other impressive types of socio-demographic diversity. In short, these 2 party lists, Yesh Atid and Bayit Yehudi, had a very wide range of candidates, as well as a clearly staked out ideological positions, which made them stand out among the Israeli parties in this election, and I believe that's why they were, or one of the main reasons they were rewarded by the voters. In the 1984 United States presidential primaries, former Vice President Walter Mondale asked the upstart Gary Hart, "Where's the beef?" to signify that Hart has good looks, but he didn't have any specific issue or any policies. And Hart then went on to lose the Democratic Party race to Mondale. In 2013, Netanyahu lost the election, from the standpoint of the number of seats his party gained, because he also refused to provide any beef to the Israeli electorate, something that Lapid and Bennett were very eager to do. Now, from the standpoint of political marketing in Israel, this could well augur a return to substance at the expense of style and personality. The Israeli electorate has become far more sophisticated than it used to be regarding the use and misuse of the media in general and political spinning specifically. Which leads me to my last point. During the 2003 elections, 10 years ago, in Israel, I researched the use of new media by the parties, especially how well the parties used their sites, their party sites on the internet. And I found then that only a few parties had begun even to understand that the internet is at base an interactive medium, not a traditional top-down Web 1.0 mode of communication, but one that enables bottom-up and perhaps most importantly, peer-to-peer communication, citizen to citizen. We are now in the Web 2 era, and the issue of how party sites function is far less important than it used to be, for the simple reason that an increasing number of the public has taken matters, the Israeli public has taken matters into its own hands through citizen-driven activity on digital media. And as an example of this trend is the issue of the TV campaign ads in Israel, where most of you know 2 weeks are allotted right before the election day. 2 weeks are allotted for each party a certain amount of time, depending on how many seats they have in the previous Knesset, to post on the 3 TV channels and on the radio their TV propaganda. The viewership of these political propaganda commercials is quite low. But if and when there's a sexy ad, and some of them this year were very sexy, actually literally sexy. For example, a party you probably never heard of called the Kalkala Party had a very attractive young woman who's fully clothed, stands there and starts talking about all the different taxes that the middle class have to deal with. And every tax she mentioned, another piece of clothing came off until she was literally left with her bra and panties on. This caused a mini scandal in Israel. All the Israelis tend to deal with this kind of stuff with some aplomb. In any case, when you do have a commercial like this, then it goes viral on Facebook and YouTube, et cetera, under the radar, so to speak. So when the newspapers in Israel kept on reporting that this is a boring campaign, I'm using their terminology, they were looking at the scene, basically, from the heights of the traditional media, ignoring the tumult beneath their radar within the new media. Obviously, this presents huge challenges for the media researcher or anyone trying to follow and report on election campaigns. We saw this in the 2012 Obama campaign with its pointless marketing based on data mining, and it would be well worth our while to start taking new media campaigning seriously in Israel as well, as the digital generation comes of age and becomes a significant part of the electorate. Indeed, this also explains the great election surprise, quote unquote, Yesh Atid's 19 seats, when the polls only gave them 10 to 14. Well, what happened? Almost all Israeli pollsters don't call cell phones. They call people on the landline phones, and the younger generation in Israel no longer has a landline phone, so nobody was literally polling them. These voted massively for Lapid, ergo the quote-unquote surprise. So here's possibly the second watershed. 2013 may mark the beginning of a new type of election campaign in Israel, one in which the old rules of the game no longer apply. Indeed, given the astounding fact that close to half of the new members of Knesset in this new Knesset are rookies. In other words, 53 or 57 of the 120 members of Knesset have never been in the Knesset before. We can only hope that the new rules of the game will be established, and not only for the campaigning, but actually during the ensuing 4 years of government. But that's fodder for a future symposium here at the University of Maryland. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I introduced myself as a professor here at the University of Maryland, and in so doing, I ended my career because I forgot to introduce the dean. She has graciously agreed to say a couple of words, and I just want to make a point here to put this in context. Inviting the dean to open symposia is a pretty traditional thing, and it lends both luster to the symposium and its sort of official status of being part of the college. In this particular case, Professor Bonnie Dill, who is currently the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at Maryland, comes to this from her last position as head of Women's Studies, a program that she led with considerable distinction, and introduced, people think of women's studies as sort of an issue or a field interested only in gender, but in fact her work deals with race, gender, and ethnicity, and I suspect that nothing could be more relevant to the topic that we are discussing here today. Her last book was Emerging Intersections? Yeah, I can't read my own writing, I'm sorry. Emerging intersections, race, class, and gender in theory, policy, and practice. And if you can say anything that will make sense out of Israel, that would be grateful. Professor Jill, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and on behalf of the College of Arts and Humanities, welcome to the University of Maryland. Bernie, no, you did not end your career. In fact, you really kind of saved me because I don't want to disrupt the flow of what's going on so much, so I won't say as much now. So you probably saved me and saved the audience as well. But I do want to say that I'm really thrilled to be here and thrilled to see so many of you here. I think the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies is one of the most exciting programs on the campus. They are bringing wonderful speakers and focusing on important issues. They have a growing number of undergraduates and a new graduate program, and really do help us do what is part of the motto of the College of Arts and Humanities, which is to train our students to be worldwide. And I really think, we've all in the United States been so wrapped up in the US elections and what was happening in the inauguration and all of these kinds of things, that helping us look at the Israeli elections which just occurred and the relationships between these two things, as I was listening to our last speaker talking about the flow of ideas and information and people kind of across borders and the influences of new media, which have played such an important role in shaping the elections in the United States, that I think it's really important to have this comparative perspective, to take kind of what we know from our daily living and look at Israel in particular and what's going on there and what difference it makes. So I really want to thank you all. I'm not going to say much more. Thank you for being here, welcome you to the campus, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Professor Bill. Tamara Kaufman-Wittis is a senior fellow and director of the Sabin Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. From 2009 to 2012, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East. She oversaw the Middle East Partnership Initiative, a State Department program that seeks to strengthen civil society, empower women and youth, and increase political participation. Her most recent book, Freedom's Unsteady March, The American Role in Building Arab Democracy, was published in 2008 by the Brookings Institution Press. Professor Tamara Kaufman-Wittis.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much, and let me say how grateful I am for the invitation to come out to campus and be with you today, and to see what you built here and what a fantastic community there is around this set of issues at Maryland. So what I'll try to do in the next few minutes is just give you a little bit of a sense of the foreign policy significance, and particularly the significance for U.S.-Israel relations of these political events. As you heard, foreign policy did not play much of a role in this campaign. And indeed, politicians didn't seem to think there was much of a percentage for them in talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or even the threat from Iran in the course of this political campaign. And that's quite unusual for Israeli politics. So the first thing we have to do is understand why that happened. Now, another colleague of yours here at University of Maryland, who's also a colleague of mine in the Saban Center, Shibli Telhami, does a series of polls here in the US and around the region, including among the Israeli public. And his most recent poll happened in November, immediately after the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza conflict. And there are a couple of really relevant statistics that I wanted to pull out from that. The first is that 40% of Israelis in that poll, and this is after the ceasefire was announced and took hold, 40% of Israelis said that they believed violence from Gaza would not end even if there was a peace agreement with the Palestinians. And 55% of Israeli Jews polled in this survey didn't believe that peace with Palestinians would ever happen. And that's despite the fact that you can still get a majority of Israelis supporting a two-state solution. And we have very consistent data on that question. So Israelis essentially, the Israeli public has lost faith in the prospects for peace. And therefore, for Israeli politicians, there is no percentage in pushing that issue in the election. Secondly, they've lost faith because the process seems stuck. There is no process, in effect. There have been no active negotiations for several years. And the region, of course, around Israel and around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict zone is in turmoil in many other ways, making Israelis, and Palestinians, I should add, anxious about their environment, uncertain, and less likely to be interested in taking risks on behalf of a negotiated agreement. Now, given that, maybe it's surprising, maybe not, that the only Israeli politician who actually made a point of putting forward any vision for how to handle the Palestinian issue in the election campaign was a politician of the right, Naftali Bennett, who put forward his plan essentially to annex Area C, which is the area of the West Bank that is still under full Israeli control under the Oslo Accords. If you think about it, that suggests that there's a significant vacuum in the Israeli political landscape on the Palestinian issue, a point I'll come back to in a moment. So within Israel, there's a disinclination to engage on this issue. In Washington, also, I think if we're being honest, we would also say that there's a disinclination to engage or invest significantly on trying to revive the Middle East peace process right now. Broadly speaking, in terms of global strategy, the Obama administration has emphasized repeatedly its desire to close a chapter of American foreign policy that's heavily invested in the Middle East and Southwest Asia and focus more resources on what's called the pivot to East Asia, to focus on commercial diplomacy and other things that will generate growth and innovation in the American economy. And to the extent that the Middle East remains a focus of American foreign policy, the primary attention is given to the nuclear threat from Iran. And I want to emphasize that the White House's concern over nuclear weapons development in Iran is not simply a concern driven by its worries for the security of its allies in the region, including Israel. This is, for the White House, a very sincere and deeply held priority because President Obama himself has put such a strong emphasis on nuclear non-proliferation and more broadly the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. He's invested in it. It was one of the major initiatives on foreign policy that he launched during his first term when he didn't launch many initiatives personally on foreign policy. He hosted a non-proliferation conference at the White House. And from a White House perspective, this is, with all of the upheaval of the Arab Spring, the prospect of Iran getting nuclear weapons is the one thing that they think would fundamentally destabilize the region and demand a kind of deep American engagement. And so it is a relentless focus of this White House. I think a third reason why there's a disinclination in Washington to invest much in Middle East peace efforts right now is, frankly, that they understand Israeli politics and the Israeli political landscape, and they see no champion in Israel for a peace process. So if they were to make the case, and they do still make the case quite consistently, saying that a two-state solution is the only stable and lasting solution of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, that there is urgency associated with this question, that without a negotiated two-state solution, the future is bleak for Israeli security and Israeli democracy, and they worry about that. So you hear all of that articulated, and yet they understand that they can't go too much beyond that because they're not going to find anyone on the other side taking that outstretched hand. So it's striking, but perhaps not surprising, that when Senator Kerry went before the Foreign Relations Committee last week for his confirmation hearing, he didn't even mention the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in his opening statement, which, you know, for me, having worked on Middle East policy issues in this town for 20 years, I don't think I would have imagined that a candidate for Secretary of State would not make that one of the top 3 or 4 things that he would mention when going before the Senate. So I think that does say something profound about what's happened to the place of this issue. Now, all that said, let me give you a couple of reasons why I think it's very unlikely that this situation is going to remain this way for long. And why I think it's very likely that the Middle East peace process or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will not simply fade into the background of U.S.-Israeli relations or of U.S. diplomacy in the region, but rather that one way or another it is going to emerge as a burning issue for U.S. foreign policy and for U.S.-Israeli relations. The first, getting back to the point I made earlier about Israeli politics, is that politics hates a vacuum, like nature. There's an opportunity here for aspiring Israeli politicians. And I think you heard from our first speaker that we have some new actors in the field. They're still figuring out how they want to position themselves in public. Now they're going to learn lessons from their successes or failures in this campaign. Depending on the stability of this coalition, they may be thinking about another election 2 years from now. And so some political entrepreneur might try to seize this issue. There's an opportunity. Israelis understand that they are in a stalemate with respect to this conflict. 45% of those polled in Shibley's poll in November said that neither side won in the Gaza conflict. And as I noted, they expect this to simply continue. So if Israelis see themselves facing a future of stalemate punctuated by occasional spasms of violence, that's not a particularly attractive future. And if somebody can offer them something better, they might go for it. A second reason I think this issue is not going to remain in the background is because the region, and especially the Palestinians living cheek by jowl with Israel, is not frozen in time. The Palestinian Authority is facing a constant but an exacerbating economic crisis. There's nothing new about that, but it is getting steadily worse. But more than that, the Palestinian Authority and the PLO are facing a political crisis, a crisis of legitimacy amongst Palestinians. Mahmoud Abbas, who was elected president in 2005, has not been re-elected since. There are no prospects on the horizon for Palestinian elections, and yet he has not been able to deliver statehood for his people. And so while everyone understands why there haven't been elections and that the division between the West Bank and Gaza presents a fundamental challenge to political progress for Palestinians, yet they are impatient. More broadly, the Arab Spring has reverberations within Palestinian society. We saw Palestinians demonstrating in unprecedented numbers as the Arab Spring burst forth in other countries, demonstrating for unity, for reconciliation between the West Bank and Gaza, and a degree of popular mobilization among Palestinians that we hadn't seen for several years prior. And that suggests that there's a potential for challenges to the structure of Palestinian politics right now, the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, that have structured the interlocutors for Israel, for the United States, for the EU, and for the region. The Arab Spring is also having significant implications in Syria, as is obvious, and in Jordan. And the Jordanians are facing real challenges to stability there, both because of an influx of Syrian refugees, but also because of a crisis of political and economic reform within their own country. And so as the region becomes a more and more uncertain place, Israel, and particularly Israeli security officials and Israeli political leaders who are responsible for Israeli security, have to think more and more urgently about what they can do to shape their operating environment and not simply be passive in the face of the turmoil going on around them. So how can they deal with the changes in the region? How can they orient themselves to new governments like the government of Egypt in ways that will preserve the gains they have, like the Camp David Treaty or the treaty with Jordan, and protect against some of the worst potential impacts of the Arab awakening, like the civil war in Syria? They need partners, they need allies in the neighborhood. And I think inevitably that is going to lead them to make different kinds of calculations about the relative risks and costs and advantages of launching some kind of new initiative with respect to their nearest Arab neighbors, the Palestinians. So I will stop there and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
And since I haven't screwed up again, so I can. Our third speaker is Professor Yoram Perry, who holds the K Chair in Israel Studies and is the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the university. He and I once had neighboring offices when we were both young and when I had hair. His most recent book, but we've gone on nevertheless. His most recent book, Generals in the Cabinet Room, How the Military Shapes Israeli Policy, was published in 2006 by the United States Institute of Peace. Since 2011, he has been the editor of the Israel Studies Review, the flagship academic journal for the Association for Israel Studies. In addition to his academic career, Dr. Perry was a political advisor to the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. He was editor-in-chief of the Israeli daily newspaper Davar and a spokesman for the Israeli Labor Party. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Yoram Perry.
Thank you, Benny, for introducing me. Had it been in Israel, you should have not mentioned the Labour Party, because it's not in Israel. Here, it's all right.
Sorry, Davar is gone too. So.
Yes, but you see, in these elections, one of the fascinating phenomena was the decline of the number of new members of Knesset who came from the military. Only 4 generals. So the generals are out. What is in is journalists. And now there are 9 members of Knesset who are journalists or media people. And it's a very interesting topic to discuss why the journalists went out and the journalists went in. But I want to start more systematically in analyzing the elections. And to start with the traditional distinction that political scientists do between 3 kinds of elections. That is critical elections, which are a watershed, which have long-standing realignment, and Israel had only one such critical election in 1977, when the Labour Party lost power after 33 years. They started in 1933 and ended in 1977. They had a world record of being in power for such a long time, 44 years. And so these were the critical elections. And the other 2 are reinforcing elections or preserving elections. There's a 4th kind of elections which we shouldn't discuss at all, that's anomalous elections. Now everybody in Israel, and here as well, was sure that these are going to be reinforcing elections. Everybody was sure that the power of the right-wing bloc will dramatically increase. The right-wing bloc, right and nationalist if you want, and religious parties had 64 seats out of the 120 in the Knesset, while the center-left bloc had 56 seats. And the expectations were up to a change, up to 71 for the right wing and 49 for the left. What happened is that the number of seats for the right-wing bloc went down to 61, 49. 59. 60, 61, 59. So that's a major change. The expectations were totally collapsed. Why did it happen? It happened because in the last 10 years or so, there were two major processes in Israeli society. One was a shift towards the right, to the nationalist or ultra-nationalist, in some cases even racist pole. And the second tendency was a shift towards the religious pole, which we invented a new term for that in one of the latest issues of our journal. We called about the process of religionization of Israeli society. These two tendencies had both ideological background and demographic background. And everybody was sure that in these elections you will have many more people who support these two tendencies, and therefore we'll see this shift between the two major blocs. And that didn't occur. All the posters and the pundits and others wrote about it. They should have looked at one simple question that was asked in one of the newspapers. People were asked, from whom would you buy a second-hand car? They gave a list of leaders. Netanyahu, only 21% would have bought a car from him. Indeed, in the elections, he got 22%. So instead of having sophisticated theories, look at who do you trust to sell you a second-hand car? Now, the mistake was, of course, and it continued after the elections, by foreign journalists who write in Israel, and some people who live in Washington here, to discuss the implications of the elections on the peace process. Forget about it. That was not the issue in the elections. The social media in Israel, in the social media, only 24% of the items related to these issues. 74% related to social economic issues. When Israelis were asked what are the most important issues in the elections, what we call the political, which is Palestinians, territories, war, peace, was fourth on the list. They don't care about it anymore. They are tired and don't care about it anymore. Now you have to add to that the fact that about 60% of the Israelis, 70% of the Israelis do not believe that there will be peace in the next 10 years, 20 years, in our lifetime, in our generation, depends how the question is being asked, 70%. And many, almost similar figure, said there is no difference between the position of the parties on this issue. So the political issue, Palestinians, territories, peace, war, etc., is not relevant to the elections. And it will continue not to be relevant to the elections. Even Lapid, who said that he will demand as one of his demands to join the coalition, the re-initiation of the negotiations, said not because we believe that we'll achieve anything, but to put less pressure on Israel, to defer the pressure from the outside on Israel. It's a tactical request. So this is not the issue. What is the issue? The issue is something else, and that is changes in Israeli society. The protest movement in the summer of 2011 had a major impact on Israeli society. And the questions that were raised then, which are cost of living, you know that the demonstration started because of the price of the cottage cheese, which is a very famous and popular cheese in Israel. So that was the reason for the first demonstration, the price of cottage cheese. Then it moved to housing, to transportation, and other issues. These are the issues, domestic, social, and economic. And indeed what you see is that the two changes that I spoke about, the nationalization or the movement towards the right, did occur within the right-wing bloc, not in Israeli society. Israeli society remained as it is, with the three blocs, the left, the center, and the right, with the religious. But the changes took care within the right-wing bloc. There you do see a major change. It's not only Bennett who wanted to annex Area C in the territories. It's also very many people within the Likud party, including Feinstein, who is willing to solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue by giving $500,000 to every Palestinian family and to send them away. And other ideas like that. So there is a major change within the bloc. it absolutely moved to the right. And there is a change in the level of religiosity in Israeli society. The religious element became much more important than it used to be in the collective identity of the Israelis. This Knesset will have for the first time a third of the members who are religious people. 39 out of 120 are religious people. Some of them are liberal, progressive, whatever, but others are terrible. And I used a very, very, very understatement word. I don't want to get into more details about it, what they say. Well, one of them, for example, said that the Temple Mount should be bombed, disappear in one of the election meetings. And there are other things. So these tendencies, which are dangerous tendencies, do occur, but within the right-wing bloc. Luckily, we see that the Israeli society is balanced, and it is a deep divided society, and the conflict between the two major camps continue to exist. So what we see really is there is a weakness on the left, and the major weakness of the left is that they ignore the Arabs. The Arabs are 10% of the Israeli electorate. They have now they have 11 seats out of 12. But no one in Israel, in any party, see them as possible candidate for a coalition. And that makes the left-wing bloc automatically smaller. If they cannot be partners, then you lose 10% of the bloc. The only time where they were included was when Rabin was Prime Minister for the second time, and they didn't join the coalition, but they supported the coalition. And after he was assassinated, they moved, and because of this process of nationalism that took place in the last decade, there is less and less understanding and willingness to incorporate the Israeli Arabs into the Israeli society. So the left is divided between, center and left is divided between on both issues. You have those who are more moderate and those who are more willing to negotiate peace. And on the economic issue, those who are more social democrats and those who are neoliberal. And Lapid, for example, supports the economic policies of Netanyahu, therefore he finds it so easy to join this coalition. So therefore what we see now, what I predict, is the same coalition that Netanyahu had when he became Prime Minister for the first time. He will have a left-wing wing, yet Lapid will be in this position, and a right-wing flank with one or two of the religious parties. He will be in the center. Israeli prime ministers always prefer to be in the center. They can manipulate between the two wings. He will talk about resuming the negotiations with the Palestinians without really meaning anything, without aiming at reaching anything. So that will be more or less, it will be the same coalition. What will change is the fact that you have a few many new faces in the Knesset. The protest movement was a great success from that point of view. For the first time, we have 3 leaders of student organizations in the Knesset, people who are in the 20s. For the first time, we have the largest number of women in the Knesset. Not enough, only 27, but 5 more than in the last Knesset. For the first time, we have leaders from the civil society, very many leaders from civil society. While Israel moved towards the extreme right, there was an outburst of energies in civil society in Israel. And for the first time, people realized that you cannot make a real change if you stay only in civil society. You have to climb up to the political echelon. And that's what they did. The number of voters climbed up, again, against all the predictions. And young people voted much more than previously against predictions. Usually, in the last 10 years, it went down. Now it went up. So you have more young people, new faces, people who represent new groups of new perceptions, new ideas. They don't care so much about the Palestinians in the West Bank and the occupation. They will have to take care of that later on, they will realize. But what they would like to emphasize is the issues that are related to domestic, economic, social gap, the relations between the religious and the non-religious, the fact that too many thousands of young Israelis go to study in religious schools instead of serving in the military, that sort of thing. So that, they will work on that. Let me just end with one more sentence, and that is these elections showed dramatically the decline of parties in Israel. The demise of parties, the thesis that is being discussed for the last 2 decades in Europe and Israel as well, we could see that now very much so in Israel. Many parties call themselves parties, they are not parties. There are lists of candidates that were led by a leader. In the past, only the religious parties had that concept. The rabbis said who is going to be on the list. Today you have very many liberal and secular parties that are the same. The party led by Yesh Atid, the party led by Lapid, he decided who is going to be on his list. He chose 19, more than 19, he chose 25 or 30, but he chose the people who are going to be on the list. Tzipi Livni chose the people who are going to be on her list. So the level of democracy within the parties has declined, which shows you that the parties have lost their meaning the way that they had in the past. Very many of the Israeli parties are not really parties, but simply lists of candidates that went together because the leader asked them to be there. So that's another phenomenon that should be looked into in the same way that what I mentioned earlier, the fact that there are less generals and more generalists. And there are many other issues that should be discussed. We don't have time for that. That's the reason why I love elections. Elections are not only fascinating because they are real drama. Elections are important because you can see undercurrents. You can see deep processes that usually you cannot find in societies. And during that short period of time, if you look well, you can find fascinating topics. So there are a few others, hopefully you will ask me about. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you first of all to our speakers and to the Dean for addressing us. I guess what we'll do is take questions from the floor. If you have a question for a specific person, please point out who you're referring to, and we'll take a couple and then perhaps agglomerate them together afterwards. But let's start with individual questions. So,
Here.
Over here.
Here.
oh, sorry. Yes, please.
Yes, I had a quick question about Lapid's platform, which included, of course, the Haredim to serve in the army. Now, I understand that as a platform position, but does it really stand any chance whatsoever of him taking a step in that direction and actually having any kind of a success, or is it just a talking point?
Sam, you want to ask?
I usually hesitate to predict anything, especially when it comes to Israeli politics. I'm willing to go out on a limb and say absolutely yes. The Israeli public is extremely disgusted with the situation. Another reason, by the way, that I think Netanyahu lost popularity in the last half a year is he had a golden opportunity when Mofaz joined the government last May to actually put through some kind of a draft, new draft law to draft the Haredim. He did not do so. And now he has no choice, because without Lapid, there basically isn't a government. And this is, I'd say, the number 1 or 2 things on Lapid or the Yesh Atid's agenda. And one also has to understand that from the standpoint of Netanyahu and the Likud, it's a yes. In other words, they're for it. Until now, they've been very worried that if they pushed it too far, they would lose their coalition of partners. The Haredim now are in an extremely weak political situation. The government can be formed without any Haredim at all. You probably will find in the end Shas joining the government, but Shas has already indicated that they're willing to go for some kind of a draft law. So that's why I think that, yes, it's finally going to happen.
Though I guess it will be in stages.
Yeah.
They will find a compromise. First of all, the military doesn't want to mobilize all of them. Secondly, there are 3 proposals. Each one of them is talking about a process of 5 years. So the question is how many will be mobilized every year. They will find a compromise. The compromise is the name of the game in Israeli politics, which was always a coalition politics, and therefore you had to have compromise. So I'm sure they will find it.
I think it might also be added that there are always lots of unintended consequences to these things. The move to add large numbers of people who served already, but to give them a religious justification by creating the yeshivot hesder, to some extent radicalized or changed the nature of the army in ways that became very problematic for Israeli society. There's every evidence that that would happen again if Haredim joined the army too. Another question. Oh.
For whoever wants to ask it, answer it, how would you rate the effect of the 400,000 people who came out in the streets in the summer of 2011, the tent cities protest? How was that manifested in the election? There were a few individuals, but how would you see it changing Israeli politics at this point, if at all?
The question is the tent city or the protest movement, the equivalent of our Wall Street sit-ins and so forth, that took over the streets in Israel a couple of years ago. What was the impact? How did that express itself in the election?
As I said already, I think that it had a major impact on Israel, in the elections. Not only that many of them joined parties, many more than we expected last time, but the increased number of young people who voted, who went to vote was one reason, and the issues that were discussed are the same. Let me tell you a story. I was fascinated with this phenomenon in the summer of 2011, and I went to talk to them, and I spent evenings talking to the people. To my surprise, they didn't talk about the Palestinians and the war and the conflict. They spoke only about domestic issues. And I asked one of them, who wrote the play Boged, which is going to be shown in Georgetown next week, and the students who want to join me can go and watch the play. Boaz Gaon told me after a while, enough, I don't want to hear it anymore. All the time you talk only about the Palestinians and the peace. Forget about it. I was in a shock. He's a gentle guy. I was in a shock. And then I realized that there is a major difference between the generations. The younger generation was born into the occupation. For them, there's Israel, which includes the territories, and has many problems. The price of cottage, the occupation, transportation, etc., etc., etc. And they see it as one unified issue. They have to tackle it. For my generation, the source of the problem in Israel is the occupation, the continuation of the occupation. That's not their point of view. I learned it only after 3 or 4 evenings talking to these people. And therefore, when we saw what happened in the elections, the fact that the issues were social and economic and not the political one, I could understand why it happened. Many still don't understand that.
Can I add let me add one point quickly on this, which is that I agree with everything Yoram said, but I think that the campaign in some way masked a class division that is going to emerge when the government has to start making some tough decisions about the budget. So the tent city and the mobilization in the streets was about middle-class anxieties. The price of cottage cheese, rents in downtown Tel Aviv, the problems of young people who want to get married and buy an apartment, and equity issues like service by the ultra-Orthodox are related to these middle-class anxieties. But the budget challenges that the Israeli government is going to face once it's formed relate to social welfare provision to the lower classes, and Israel's lower classes are suffering. That debate was obscured by this focus on the tent city and Occupy and so on. And I think that Lapid, who managed to kind of get 19 seats on the backs of the middle class, is going to have to decide, where in the class divide he's going to come down.
I can just mention an inside story now that I can tell after the election. My former doctoral student and now colleague of mine is number 7 on Yesh Atid, Dr. Aliza Lavi, And when I talked to her during the campaign about a month ago, I said to her, well, what are you running on? And she said, look, we have all kinds of issues, but Lapid did polling among the potential supporters, and one issue came through loud and clear. It's the only issue that they care about, and that's the economic, housing. Forget about everything else. They want to be able to lower the economic burden. So I think that he understands, as you said, that his bread is being buttered by the middle class, the young bourgeois, and that's where you're going to find most of the economic reforms. And there are many reforms to be done, but the lower class, I think, is going to be left out again.
Let me just see if any of the students give me priority, sir.
Okay, so considering the lack of privatization of Israeli civil society when it comes to Palestinian occupation, etc., how do you think that frames the Israeli-Palestinian issue? Because it would be hard for me to believe that Palestinian civil society and political parties don't put Israel at the top of their priorities. They don't try to prioritize occupation, they try to prioritize violence, they try to prioritize building separation walls, confiscating land. So, I mean, what does that say about how you frame the issue, how you frame an economy?
Excuse me, can I just ask for a clarification? Are you saying that you assume that Israeli Arab parties put those issues at the top?
The
No,
Palestinians.
he said Palestinians.
Yes.
Okay.
That's an obvious observation. You are absolutely right, but it's an obvious observation. The weaker, the occupied, always look up to the occupier. How many Israelis speak Arabic, and how many Palestinians in the West Bank speak Hebrew? That will give you the answer. How much of the Palestinian journals or newspapers cover Israel? How much of the Israeli newspapers in Hebrew cover the Palestinians? 50% of the items on the Palestinian newspapers deal with Israel. 0.1% of the Israeli newspapers deal with the Palestinians. When you are occupied, this is your existence. And you deal with it all the time. Sometimes even you over-deal with it. Everything is related to the occupation, even if it's not related. If you are the occupier, and it's not pleasant to be an occupier, you ignore it. And it's easy. You build a huge wall. You paint beautiful pictures on the wall, green pictures on the wall of trees and flowers, and you forget about it.
Well, I think Yoram's absolutely right. And for that reason, I actually think that this problem is exacerbated in recent years by the completion of the security barrier, fence, wall, whatever you want to call it, and by the decline in terrorism. So that for Israelis who are living in the coastal plain, the occupation is not something that affects their lives. They don't see it, they don't feel it, it doesn't shape their choices, their behavior in any way. And, you know, for those of us who lived in Israel during the first Intifada, as I did, that was very different. So there is an asymmetry that I think is worse today than it's been. I think that the fact that, and we have polling on the Palestinian side as well, that says Palestinians have also lost faith in the prospects for a negotiating process to achieve a two-state solution, although they still support a two-state solution by majority. So where do they go? Okay, what are their options? And without a leadership that they believe is effectively advocating for their cause, I think the alternative is mass mobilization or something much more destructive even than that. And that's one of the other reasons why I think this issue is not going to remain on the back burner, because we know throughout the long and tortured history of this conflict that if it's not moving forward, it's degrading. And I would say that today the status quo between Israelis and Palestinians is degrading at an accelerating rate.
May I add another point here, which I think we have to add that, because don't forget what happened in the last 2 years. That's the Arab awakening. For many Americans who are by nature optimistic, it has a lot of opportunities. But for the Israelis, who are, like most Jews, worried always, they see the threats. And indeed, if you talk to the majority of the Israelis, not only on the left, on the right, but also on the left, they will tell you who knows what's going to happen in Egypt. with the Muslim Brotherhood. Maybe they will start a war with Israel. The probability of having war between Israel and Egypt was discussed at length in Israel in the last year. It's a ridiculous option, to my mind, but it was discussed. What about Jordan? The Jordanian regime is not very stable. What about Syria? They are going to be taken over by the fundamentalists. And not mentioning, of course, the nuclear warhead that will arrive from Iran. So under these circumstances, to talk about Palestinians, territories, giving back territories, peace, what are you talking about? We have to survive first. We're a villa in the jungle, as the former Minister of Defense said. He left already, but the concept has remained.
In the past, there were always generals and colonels in the Knesset who brought a certain amount of understanding of the military that you said the generals are now declining. We've only got a couple left. Is that going to change the understanding of the war and the potential and the need for the defense by having less of those senior people?
No, because we have four highest-ranking officers from the police instead. For the first time in the history of the Knesset, we have 4 high-ranking officers of the police, which are equal to generals, and we have for the first time 3 heads of the security services. So we still have some people who are involved in the security field. But the issue is more serious than I presented it. And what is happening, the Israeli military for a long time was one of the bastions of Israeli cool, calculated, serious analysis of the power relations between Israel and the Arab world. And they were not warmongers, they were not militarists. The militarist values came from other quarters of Israeli society, not from them. And the fascinating phenomena, and I urge you to go and see the movie, there's a new movie in town. I guess not, it will be in public cinema halls in the near future after it gets the Oscar, or at least nominated to Oscar, which is called The Gatekeepers. 6 heads of the security services are talking about Israel's occupation. And the things that they said are unbelievable. It's really unbelievable. The most liberal, leftist, progressive politicians in Israel did not talk about the occupation the way they talk. They speak about the danger of the occupation, the corrupting nature of the occupation on Israeli society, the corrupting nature of the occupation on the relations between Jews and Arabs. One of them said, after you finish a position as a chief of the security service, you have to become a leftist. A bit, he added. A leftist, a bit. So the military until now has been more, look at what happened last year when Barak and Netanyahu advocated attacking Iran. It was the supreme command of the military and the security services that stood firm against it. I believe that these relations between the ideologues in the upper echelon of the political spectrum and the pragmatists among the professionals will continue in the next several years. If things will continue, it might change with a growing number of Orthodox officers. But until now, I think it is the same. It will continue as it is in the next in the next term of government. Yeah,
actually, I wanted to ask you a question about the gatekeepers. In the movie, there's Yaakov Perry, who is, I believe, number 3 on Yesh Atid's list. I'm not sure if he says this, but a number of the Shin Bet leaders say, when we were in charge, we wish that decision makers as part of the government had taken different actions related to the occupation, or had a real strategy to deal with it. So Yaakov Perry, I know that he has said, and I believe Lapid has backed him up, that resuming peace negotiations is a condition for joining the coalition. Do you see his presence assured presence in a coalition as being something that could push the government towards real peace negotiations, or as a fault line in a potential coalition?
I'm going to answer that from left field, as they say in baseball. When the Likud primaries ended on that evening, Hanan Kristal, one of the top political analysts in Israel, said that it's a good thing that Netanyahu did not have to run in the primaries, his own party primary. Obviously, the leader of the party doesn't run. The winner of the primary becomes number 2, et cetera, et cetera. Hanan Kristal said because if he did run, he would have ended up in 25th place. Netanyahu is probably the most, or certainly one of the most, left-wing moderates in the Likud. The answer, and therefore, as Yoram said, I definitely think there's going to be noises about restarting the process. To get Lapid wants to hear that, and Tzipi Livni certainly wants to hear that. But I don't see Netanyahu being able to move very far along in any kind of peace process when he's got 25, as we would say, Michiganers in his own party, not to mention Beit Yehudi if they're in the party, which is going to be a complete no-no. So unfortunately, that's the answer.
To add to that, look at the generation. Perry belongs to the older generation, and therefore he, like us, see the Palestinian-Israeli issue as the core of the problem of Israeli existence, while the majority of the members of Yesh Atid list are very young. So how much power he will have within the group, I'm not sure.
You know, I'm going to take advantage of my own position here as moderator to ask a question about something that I think hasn't been addressed, but which in fact might be implicit in some of the things that you've said. And perhaps, Professor Lehman-Wiltzig, this might come to you directly because of the way I'm going to pose it, but in fact it's for everybody. When you get revolutions where you suddenly introduce a whole bunch of new people, we call it the Tea Party or we call it whatever, the implications are not always clear, but one thing is clear, and that is that you're rejecting the people who were already there. And if any observer of Israeli, and for that matter Palestinian politics, has got to be aware of the reputation for corruption, which is so overwhelming. I mean, every single leader gets called up for some kind of corruption and then gets let off, but not let off. Can Olmert come back, and was this, and did so-and-so take too much money, and which minister of finance has been in jail, and the rhetoric about what happened to money that goes to the Palestinians is, of course, legion and things like that. Now, we hear about Hamas, for instance, being very successful at distributing help to the poor, and for that matter in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood being very good at providing aid to the poor, which is part of its source of popularity. But I wonder about this issue of corruption, and it is so omnipresent in the news media that I wonder if that isn't, after all, when you talk about totally new faces and people simply throwing out the old people, isn't that what's going on here? And isn't that the problem that the Palestinians are facing as well?
First of all, I think that from the Palestinian perspective, that is absolutely correct. And in fact, I would, based on, or in reaction to what Yoram said about 15, 20 minutes ago regarding the Palestinians, that the only issue, or at least I understood him to say the only issue there is the peace process and the conquest, et cetera, et cetera. The polls there, although I'm not totally privy to them, but the polls there, from what I recall, show that for many Palestinians, corruption is number one above the Israeli conquest and holding on to the territories and lack of peace process, et cetera, et cetera. Insofar as Israeli society is concerned, I'm skeptical about the fact that Israel today is more corrupt than it was in the past. Israel today has a much more investigative media, has much more, has more attorney generals, well, this present attorney general probably not, but the entire apparatus has more teeth than it had in the past. They feel they have more public support in trying to go after corruption. I remember once doing some kind of a research on the ombudsman, or the state controller, who does the annual report on things that are going on in the government. And I went back to the first state controller reports back in 1953, 54, 55. I didn't have much hair, but my hair stood on end. It was just simply unbelievable. You had simple clerks who would take the money that came in, whether it was the tax or the car license, whatever, and take it home every day and hold it in their boidem or underneath the balata, right, and then bring it back, maybe missing a little bit of money the week. And this was endemic in the entire system, but nobody talked about it back then. Maybe you can call it Mapai corruption, although I don't think it was Mapai. If you ask me where it's coming from, here I'm very clear. It's coming from the fact that the Jews, certainly in the 50s, but I think to a large extent till today, have a political culture of the shtetl. For 2,000 years, we had to find a way to survive in a very, very antagonistic environment, and therefore we had to undercut the government, we had to circumvent the government, we had to find all kinds of ways in order to be able to simply live, not pay tax, whatever it was. And once the state was established, you just don't turn off the spigot of 2,000 years of political culture and begin to have a normal Switzerland or Swedish type of society, and it's a struggle. I would mention to you, though, since almost all of you are Americans, that if anybody really knows their American history, go back to 1830, 1840, 1850. I needn't mention Tammany Hall of the 1860s and 70s and what kind of corruption there was here in the young United States of America. So it's going to take, a few decades more. But I don't think the problem, it's certainly bad when you have prime minister after prime minister, being found out for corruption. And I don't think a Ben-Gurion was corrupt or a Menachem Begin. But on the mid-level, I think there was a lot going on there, maybe of a different sort. Having said that, yes, I agree with you that part of the reason that there was this massive turnover is that people want new faces, hoping that these new faces will not continue what went on in the past.
Sir.
Do you mind if I just
No. Just I feel it necessary to respond a little bit just on the point you made about Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, because I think that actually you're right. This is a broader phenomenon that when you have political systems that are not characterized by a lot of pluralism, and early Israeli politics until 1977 really wasn't, you're going to have corruption. Official corruption in Arab autocracies, therefore, should not be a surprise. And the perception of the Brotherhood and of Hamas in opposition as clean, yes, it came to some extent from their provision of social services, but it also came from the fact that they had no access to power. And in the Palestinian territories under Arafat, but also, Egypt under Mubarak and across the Arab world, the Muslim Brotherhood was on the outs. Resources were distributed through the state. So if you don't have access to resources, you're not going to be corrupt. What we've seen, however, since Hamas seized control of Gaza by force, is a government that is quite authoritarian, quite vengeful toward its political opposition, and quite into patronage as a means of control. And so to the extent that Hamas benefited from such a reputation earlier, I don't think it would benefit from the same today. I'd love to ask a broader question of my two co-panelists, just following on this point, which is that it seems to me an additional element here, I'd love your thoughts, is that Israel really has undergone a generational transition in political leadership. With the incapacitation of Sharon, he was the last of the founding generation to lead Israel. And then we saw Israelis turning toward generals, and to Bibi, who is a bit of an outlier in a way, but not finding this satisfying. And so I wonder whether this rise of new politicians is just part of this broader struggle to say, okay, what do we want from our next class of political leaders?
You're absolutely right. It's the fourth generation of Israeli leaders. We had the founding fathers and mothers, Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Begin. We had the second generation of the 48 generation. Rabin is the typical one. We had the third generation that was a real failure, Olmert, Netanyahu, to my position, and Barak. And now we are looking forward towards the fourth generation, which is only begins to climb up. So it's a very interesting question, what will come out of that generation. Concerning the corruption, one of the major reasons for the rise of Hamas was not that most of the Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza became religious people. They supported the Hamas because of the corruption of the Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. That was clear. In Israel does not is in a very centrist or even lower level of the echelons of corruption, not only among developing countries, but also among more advanced societies. So Israel doesn't have to feel bad when Israel looks at these international figures. Definitely not if you look at the United States. Here it's more sophisticated, but and many people don't see it. But if you look hard, you find it. But definitely it did have some impact on the young Israelis. I visited Tel Aviv University 2 weeks ago, and I saw the student newspaper, which is a huge, very big one, not a tabloid. And the cover story was about the corruption in Israeli politics. And they had 20 photos of 20 leading politicians who are running today with the entire files of the last 10 years. So if you are a new voter, 19, 21 years old, and you see these 20 names and famous people from Olmert to Netanyahu, with all these stories, you say, wow, these are corrupted people. I don't want to see any of them. And you vote for younger generation.
I won't push it, but just think. I think the issue is. I don't think we have to defend Israel as more corrupt or less corrupt. I think the issue is the issue of the image, and what you say about the newspaper is absolutely. I mean, that's why I was wondering from a communication point of view. Just the everyday reading that so and so is being investigated, so and so is investigated, and this hotel was built. I mean, it's got to have an impact. So there was a question in the back.
Hi. So my question is in regards to PA gaining observer status in the UN. Firstly, what are the effective consequences of this UN choice? I mean, obviously, I guess Israel could be more prone to being brought to the ICJ, although that's happened in the past. I'm not really clear on those issues. And then secondly, could this choice possibly be used as a tool by the Israeli government to embolden the PA by condoning diplomacy or taking up arms? And is this something which is desired in Israel and would be productive, essentially? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let me say I don't think the practical consequences are very many. Other than, as you noted, the issue of the International Criminal Court and the extent to which the Palestinians have an opportunity now to use their status as a state, as recognized by the UNGA, to appeal to the ICC. But Israel is not a signatory to the Rome Statute or to the Rome Treaty, so there are real issues of jurisdiction there. Although the ICC claims universal jurisdiction, and the signatories to the Rome Treaty claim that it has universal jurisdiction, we're also not signatories to the Rome Treaty, and we reject that argument. And there are a lot of other countries that I think would feel that this would be a very bad precedent to set, regardless of their feelings about Israel in particular. So I doubt that that's a practical problem. Now, there were those who made the argument, not only this past year, but the year prior, that Israel would have been wise to seize the opportunity of Palestine's bid for statehood at the UN, and to say, okay, let's make this the basis for parity, for addressing the asymmetry that was raised by the earlier questioner, and say, let's negotiate state to state. And we will even support your bid for statehood if we can come to agreement on X and Y. Now, Israel had potential leverage prior to the vote.
But having refused to take that opportunity either in last year or the year before, and the vote now having been taken, I don't see Israel having much leverage. And it just has to deal with the consequences. As I said, I don't think those consequences are very many. I do think that the fact that the Palestinians went ahead with that bid in the face of very strong disincentives, both from Israel and from the United States, is indicative of just what a spot this Palestinian leadership finds itself in with respect to its own population. And they've got to be able to deliver some answer, some political horizon, and they have nothing to offer right now but symbols.
Hi. So I have a question, kind of, I think combine some of the concepts that have been talked about. Oh, I'm not so sure I need this. I have a loud booming voice, blessed with it naturally. Going back to this concept of, there is, I think, a generational gap in Israel in terms of younger people who have grown up with the occupation and increased segregation with Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, naturally, with but connecting that to Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and kind of what we're seeing with comments about Khanin's, coalitions with Khanin Zouabis and all sorts of legislation proposals that are deliberately meant to kind of inhibit or limit the activities of Palestinian civil society within Israel itself. Are we seeing a trend of perhaps the younger generation trying to address an issue that Israel has set aside for a very long time, which is the minority population within Israel? This, these, 11 seats of the so-called Arab parties, one of which is Hadash, which is both Arab and Jewish.
The issue of the attitudes of the Israeli Jews to the Arabs is a major issue, and the processes that took place in the last 10 years are not very positive. But you have to understand why. In the 90s, during the Oslo period, Israelis saw an option of solving the problem in a territorial division. Jews or Israelis here and the Palestinians over there. With the collapse of the Oslo concept, a new version of nationalism has begun to develop. I would call it post-territorial nationalism. What's the difference between us and them? It's the fact that we are Jews and they are Arabs. And so you see, and therefore that's the reason why religion became much more stronger element in the collective identity of the Israelis. But unfortunately, it works against the Israeli Arabs. Because if you're an Israeli Arab, you are not part of mine. I'm a Jew, and you are an Arab. You are closer to the Palestinians on the West Bank than to me, in spite of the fact that you are a citizen of Israel and should have the same rights. So the relations between Jews and Arabs in the last 10 years have deteriorated dramatically. And both should be blamed for, both the Jews and the Arabs. The Arab leaders wrote the new documents, Mismachei HaChazon, the vision documents, in which they advocated for the first time to change the nature of Israel, to de-Zionize Israel, to make Israel a state of all its citizens. So the Israelis saw that as a proof, evidence that they are against the state of Israel. And they went to the one extreme, and the Jews went to the other extreme. There is a major gap, particularly for the younger generation, because the younger generation, their socialization was in the 20s, after 2000. They don't remember, they don't know about the Oslo period. They know the collapse of the peace agreement. They know the Second Intifada. They remember the suicidal attacks on the pubs where they went to, or the university when they went to, on the buses when they used. They know that Israel withdrew from Gaza and were attacked by the Hamas. They know that Israel withdrew from Lebanon and were attacked by Hezbollah. So the hell with it. We want to be on our own and to live not peacefully. They use a new term. Sharon was the first one who used the term, quiet. Sharon didn't talk about peace. He said quiet. We want quiet. And the Arabs the Israeli Arabs are part of the enemy. So one of the major problems of Israeli society is to work on that. And unfortunately, the Arab politicians do not help. There's a gap between the Arab politicians in the Knesset and the majority of the Arabs, the Israeli citizens. The Arab politicians talk about the occupation and the Palestinians, while the majority of the Israeli Arabs want to discuss domestic issues, integration into Israeli society, economic issues, the cottage price. And there's a huge gap between the two. And so both camps have to learn a lot and to change the policies to improve the conditions, and I don't see that in the near future.
Just to add to Yoram's point, there is a growing trend, and I don't want to make too much of this because the numbers are not huge. There's a growing trend among the Israeli Arab population to integrate further into Israeli society. The number of East Jerusalem Arabs who have now asked for Israeli citizenship has risen. Remember, it's part of Israel. They could, after 67, they could have been citizens, but of course, for ideological reasons, they didn't. Now, many of them are beginning to do so. You can say for instrumental reasons, they want Bituach Leumi, they want Social Security, whatever it is, but still that's important. And the number of Israeli Arabs, non-Druze, Israeli Arabs, Muslim and Christian Arabs who are joining the Israeli army and national service is going up as well. So from their perspective, domestic is right, and it may just be, well, if you can't beat them, join them, and perhaps by joining them, eventually the Israeli Jewish population will be more eager to integrate them into general society. But I would say, based on the first thing you said, everybody talks in political science about the nation state. There's only one nation state in the world today, and that's Israel. Because all other countries are states. We're the only state that believes in the nationhood, the Jewish nationhood, as being the raison d'etre, the basic reason for our existence, whereas, Canada and America, there's no nationality there. There's a creed. Being American is a creed, is an idea, but it's not a nation in the ethnic, pure ethnic, original sense of the word.
Speaking as a Canadian, let me assure you that what you just said is wrong.
Bernie, she has raised her hand for a long time.
Okay. First section.
Thank you. Professor Perry mentioned that, you mentioned that within the parties in Israel, there have been a trend towards the party leader choosing the members. Which is a trend that is not towards democratization. But on the other hand, within the society at large, there seems to have been bigger participation, bigger communication across the country, opening up to new places and so forth. Are these two kind of somehow conflicting, and which one would be the trend that you think would be the more kind of the winning trend?
It's a good question. They are in contradiction, you are right. But it probably occurred because of the collapse of parties. You never saw such a transition of politicians from one party to another as you saw in the last 2 months. So many of them moved from one party to another party, the third party moved back to the first party. Never in the history of Israel there was such a transition. And so the whole idea of party became really insignificant. And the leaders of the new parties or the new formed parties were able to form the lists according to their wishes. But I think that you are right. I think that it shows this transition, this turmoil. I believe that in the future, if I'm a member of one of the new parties, whether it has 11 seats in the Knesset or 20 seats in the Knesset, I wouldn't let the leader of the party decide for the next elections. I would say, no, we should have a committee of the party, if not primaries. So I believe it's a temporary phenomenon.
Again, this is more of an addition as to the question you just previously answered. You addressed how Lapid and the Yesh Atid party was addressing more socioeconomic and civil issues, which was the primary reason why they were able to gain the 19 seats in the Knesset, and also addressing the generational transition that you're talking about. They're kind of representative of that by, rather than having a party identification, they pick the leaders, like you said, with a list, but within this general transition, within the coalition and the Knesset as a whole, can they effectively, now that they're elected, effectively address the socioeconomic and civil issues that they ran in their platform? And if so, are they qualified enough to effectively reform those issues, in which what would be the reforms necessary to have an effect within the country as a whole?
Well, that's the $60,000 question. Let's meet in 4 years here, and we'll see what happens.
I think if you were to shrink that question down, it would, what's going to be the milestone? Can they pass a budget? I think this is going to be the biggest challenge facing Netanyahu's new coalition. Can they put together a coalition that will last through the end of the year and pass a budget in very, very constrained circumstances that will satisfy each of these parties' constituencies, their basic expectations, but it's not going to completely satisfy anybody because there just isn't enough money to go around.
I thought this was about Israel and not America.
It sounds familiar.
I'd like to give a contradictory answer to your question. Since 1977, almost in every election, there has been a surprise center party that's gotten more votes than people thought they would, and they promptly collapsed within 2, 3, 4 years after that. In fact, one of the more famous collapses, or perhaps the second most famous, the first was, of course, was the first one, Yigal Adin and Dash back in 77, was Yair Lapid's father, who formed the center party, and they got 12 seats about 12, 13 years ago, and it collapsed very quickly. So that's the bad news. The good news is, I think that the Yesh Atid is going to learn from the history of these center collapses. It also has more seats than any other center party, unless you want to call Kadima a center party, and then that's sort of iffy. And within this coalition, they hold much more power than any other center party ever had. So from that standpoint, and I would also add, knowing even also personally some and knowing about others, this is a pretty impressive party from the standpoint of the people in the Knesset. Among the 19 members, you've got some very, very impressive people coming from I mentioned this in my talk, coming from a whole wide array of society, not upstarts, little young people who don't know what they're doing, but mostly middle-aged people who have proven themselves in different areas and who don't have, I think, a world perspective that clashes. They all, by and large, believe in the general same thrust. So there is a chance, I wouldn't put a lot of money on it, but there is a chance that this party could actually make a big difference.
It's also relevant that Tommy Lapid's party was aimed at old people, whereas Yair Lapid's was aimed at young people. That's true. Make a difference. Any other questions, please? Yes, ma'am.
What is the ethnic makeup of the results? How much, for example, the Russian immigrants who were quite influential and are still like in the Israeli Betenu, what is their power in this past election, or whether they like the Sfaradim? I understand that they are no longer affiliated necessarily with the Likud or with the Shas, but do you have any analysis?
The two most important trends that were seen in the elections are among the Mizrahi, Sfaradim, and among the Russians. The Mizrahi left Likud. They felt that Likud betrayed them because of the economic issues. And a friend of mine who was a member of Knesset, unfortunately didn't get a seat now, told me already 2 years ago, I'm traveling up and down the country in the hardcore areas of supporters of the Likud, and I see a different picture. The Likud will lose the elections. 2 years ago he told me that. No one believed him. I'm really sorry that he didn't get into the Knesset. So they feel that they were betrayed by the Likud, and they moved. If the political issue was more important for them, they moved to Bennett, to the right. If the social and economic issue was more important to them, they moved to Lapid on the left. So they split to these two parties. The Russians, very interesting. The younger generation of the Russians left the Russian party, left Netanyahu, left Lieberman, and again either moved to Lapid or moved to Bennett, because they felt that Lieberman does not represent them. He's too Russian. They want to be more Israelis, so they can identify with the new young Israelis, either Bennett or Lapid, and the issues are different. These were the two major changes. But beyond that, you can see definitely the ethnicity and position, the socioeconomic position and parties. It's very clear. Tell me if you are a Sfaradi or an Ashkenazi, and I'll tell you which party you vote. Tell me if you are educated or university graduate or not, I'll tell you for which party you vote. Tell me where you live, and I'll tell you for which party you vote. There's a very, very strong correlation between the ethnicity, socioeconomic position, and party affiliation or party support.
Yeah, shall we, how many people still, should we make this last question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, sir.
Wonderful presentation, thank you. I was curious about we were talking about religion and politics briefly before. You had mentioned the religionization of politics and society. From my perspective, and you know, I work on the Shas party, which is the religious party that claims to represent Sephardic Jews. That was really the first religious party to go beyond the religious sector and appeal to people who are not necessarily Orthodox. From my perspective, Bennett is fascinating because his party is, as one of you had mentioned, the resurrection of Mafdal, of the National Religious Party, but it seems to be getting a lot of votes within the Israeli center. People who are not religious seem to be voting for Bennett. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, does this represent the kind of move of religious Zionism towards the state center? And do you think that's going to be a permanent feature of Israeli politics?
By saying center, you mean the center power or center on the political map?
On the political map and power, and society in general.
Because if you talk about power, definitely so. The 19th Knesset, which was elected a week ago, for the first time since the establishment of the state, will not have one representative of the kibbutz movement. In the early 50s, there were representations was 3 or 4 times more than the number of kibbutz members. Now, no one. On the other hand, before the elections, I didn't count the numbers after the elections, before the elections, for the first time, the number of settlers in the Knesset was supposed to be 12, 10% of the Knesset. There were only 4 or 5 in previous elections. I'm not sure how many were elected. Maybe it's 9 or 10. I have to check the figures. But they are double. The representation is double than they used to. The settlers moved into the center of power. And when I say the settler, I mean mainly the religious Zionists. So from that point of view, as I said, on the right wing, on the right nationalist bloc, their power has increased, definitely increased. On the other hand, you have a very interesting phenomena that though the religious members of Knesset are now a third of the Knesset, 39, they are equally divided between the ultra-Orthodox and national religious. In the past, in the first Israeli Republic until 1977, there were mainly very few ultra-Orthodox and mostly national religious. Then it moved to the other direction, and now they are equal. And the tension between the two is tremendous. So it will be a mistake to talk about the religious people or the religious member of Knesset. The tensions between these two groups are very interesting. So you have plenty of room for research, publishing articles, books, whatever, in the next 10 years.
I just want to say one thing about Bennett's party. I think your assumption, or part of your assumption was wrong. It's true that they were talking during the campaign of many of the young, non-religious voting for Bennett because he was attractive, charismatic, former businessman, high-tech, et cetera, et cetera. In the end, they didn't. They all went, or virtually all of them went to Yesh Atid. Basically, what happened with Bennett is that all the national religious voters who used to vote for the Likud, who left the National Mafdal. Remember, in 1977, the National Religious Party got 12 seats in the Knesset. In 2013, they got 12 seats in the Knesset. So basically what happened is they left, and now they've come back. It's still, by and large, religious supporters, even though Bennett himself wished to attract seculars, since he had number 5, a secular woman of all things, which is totally weird in the National Religious Party. But it's a very hardcore religious party, but going back to its glory days.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take advantage of my position to thank our panelists for wonderful analyses and wonderful answers to questions. I thank you for your patience in sitting and your questions. We should all live and be well till the next election.
Thank you very much.